Welcome to Last Orders, the Spiked podcast on all things nanny state. I'm Tom Slater, Deputy Editor at Spiked, and this is the show where myself and Chris Snowden from the Institute of Economic Affairs discuss the latest in public health killjoyism, all with the help of an invited guest. In this episode, we're joined by the comedian and Spiked columnist Andrew Doyle to talk about Britain's new porn laws, the rise of state-funded nanny state activism, and the snobby war on junk food. Hello and welcome to Last Orders, the Spiked podcast on all things nanny state. I'm Tom Slater, Deputy Editor at Spiked, and today, as ever, I'm joined by the Director of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs, Chris Snowden. Hello, Chris.
Hi up.
And today we're delighted to be joined by the comedian, the Spiked columnist, and the man behind the satirical woke tweeter Titania McGrath, Andrew Doyle. Hi, Andrew.
Hello.
So, Andrew, before we kick off, do you want to tell us a little bit about Titania and, more importantly, her new book, which has been making a bit of a stir at the moment?
Yeah, she's a radical intersectional feminist activist and slam poet. And she, she's a satire of one of those very sort of privileged, rich, white Oxbridge types who write endless guardian columns about how oppressed they are. So she's on Twitter largely. I've been on Twitter for about almost a year. And she's written a book. Basically, it's called Woke, A Guide to Social Justice, and it's about basically how to be a better person. She's a much better person than anyone else, and she wants to teach you how. And there's some slam poems in there as well. So.
Is it going down well amongst the woke people?
It's really polarizing, which is exactly the response I wanted. So but the woke lot hate it. Really hate it. There was a New Statesman review which lots of people thought I must have written because it sounds like Titania wrote it. Like it's brilliant. This utterly humorless, so it's, saying it's just, basically you shouldn't mock the language of social justice, which is that's what Titania would say. So yeah, exactly. It's the response I wanted, and so it's fun, and that's available now. So
brilliant.
Yeah.
So everyone should go look that up, buy that. But moving on, let's kick off with our first topic of today, which is porn, which we haven't talked about on this podcast before, but needs must, because from next month, or at least it was due to be billed as next month, the UK government was going to introduce a block on all adult websites to get around this new filter system. Users will be required to verify their age by either purchasing a state-approved porn pass at a shop for up to £10, apparently, a small price to pay, or otherwise enter a credit card, some sort of other ID, when they're actually on sites. This is aimed, it seems, at stopping children from being able to access porn so easily on their smartphones, but the upshot of all of it does seem to be that adult users will have to go through a quite embarrassing process to access perfectly legal material. Chris, do you want to tell us a little bit more about this? The porn laws, as they're being called.
Yeah, porn laws, yes. Well, you've more or less covered it, really. You're going to have to get something that they're going to call the Portes Pass, which is quite funny if you're on Twitter or follow economists. And I think $5.99 or $8.99. I'm not sure what you get extra for the $8.99. Maybe a longer period of time. I don't know.
So it's a premier package. You get.
Yeah, but to be honest, it's not about the price. I've had a lot of people come up to me talking about this issue, very concerned. People who are not normally that concerned about libertarian issues, but
young men, are they?
Largely men, yeah. In fact, entirely. Funny you should mention it. And they're absolutely livid about it. They can't believe it's going to happen. And I wonder really to what extent it actually will happen. I gather that the most popular porn websites run or own the software that's going to be used for these passes. So I guess it will obviously apply to them. I find it very hard to believe that the government's going to manage to persuade every single porn website in the world, most of which obviously are not based in Britain or even in the EU, to go along with this system. I just don't see how it's enforceable. So maybe it'll be like the kind of Y2K bug and everyone's worried about it, but actually wouldn't make any real difference to people. And it has to be said, in principle, there isn't anything wrong with trying to stop children looking at porn, and particularly the kind of porn that you can find on the internet. It is certainly an historical aberration, if you want to call it that. And in fact, the idea that you have to go into a shop and feel rather embarrassed is the historical norm when it comes to the porn market. The issue, I think, is the way that the government's gone about it. There does seem to be some serious doubts about the kind of security aspects of this. I suspect that a lot of people who run hardcore porn sites are not generally the kind of people who you want to have possess your credit card details or your passport number and address and all the rest of your ID. And I guess there's also a slippery slope aspect to this, which is once you've done it with porn, you can do it with anything else that the authorities don't think children, i.e. people under 18, should be looking at. And I think that is a problem. And finally, I think it really just ties into the whole internet regulation that we're seeing at the moment. I mean, the internet, in my opinion, over the last 20 years has been a kind of release valve for people at a time when society is just gradually becoming more and more oppressive. And at least you've had total freedom on the internet, and it's worked fantastically well. I know people moan about social media and this and that and these things here or there, but basically having a total laissez-faire system of communication that we call the internet has been phenomenally successful. It's been brilliant. I don't think there's actually been that many downsides to it. The politicians and the dead tree press are gunning for social media companies and the so-called tech giants at the moment, but actually they've made most people's lives much better. And now, after this brief window of freedom, I suspect the authorities are going to finally clamp down on that as well, and they're starting with porn.
Andrew, what do you make of all this? Are we in the midst of another porn panic?
Well, I mean, I would support the idea of keeping children away from pornography, obviously, and I think that's very much a parental responsibility, and it's important. But they will find a way. I mean, this, like when I was growing up and we didn't have the internet, but we found a way to find pornography. You know, it's very simple with this in terms of people will just find a VPN or some kind of way to circumvent the block. But for me, I'm concerned about this idea of regulating adults and what adults watch. I mean, this reminds me of, do you remember at the end of 2014 when the Conservatives started regulating pornography and types of pornography that could be made in the UK, and they came up with a list of what forms of, and it included things like spanking, face sitting.
I remember there was some sort of face sitting outside.
Face
Parliament.
sitting is like face sitting. Also it looked like a list of sex acts that we just disapprove of. That's effectively what it was, and it was basically making a moral judgment about consensual sexual relationships between adults, and that is a problem for me, because adults should be able to do what the hell they like. So this idea, I suspect this comes down to a kind of moral prudishness about pornography, and in many respects, I think there's an artistic value to pornography. I don't want to stand here and defend pornography in that way, but even great art has pornographic elements in it. I mean, Camille Paglia often talks about Michelangelo being a pornographer, and the idea of sexual experience and sexual and voyeurism and all of this is actually part of the human experience. And once you start clamping down on it, I think there's a problem with that. Ultimately, however, I just think people should have to do what the hell they want and watch what the hell they want. And the other major issue I have with this is it's a hacker's dream, basically. I mean, it's effectively building up a kind of database where a hacker can find your information, find what you're searching for. Now, that doesn't matter with me, right? Because I'll talk about this stuff on stage. It doesn't bother me. But but if you've got like a proper job, like if you work in government or if you're a clergyman or whatever, you probably don't want people knowing that you're searching for double penetration with whatever. I mean, it just probably doesn't. It's not good optics for certain people.
For a vicar,
for a vicar,
And on that point, as Matthew Lesh, one of our friends from the Adam Smith Institute who are running this campaign around it, has pointed out, that Age ID, which is one of the main kind of age verification services, which is kind of owned by the same company as people like Pornhub and RedTube, these big porn websites. Apparently, since 2012, they've had 5 major data breaches as well.
Really?
So,
well, that says it all.
Hackers inserting malware into code on websites, etc., and then people stealing their details. So it doesn't bode well, does it?
The temptation's too great. I think if you have that information, we already know with the cloud and that kind of technology that hackers are able to find a way. They devote their whole lives to this. They will find a way to access that information and use that information. And that's just not a good situation to be in. And I think it's weird that the government would want to enable that, or that they haven't even thought about how that could happen. It's like they don't understand how the internet works.
Chris, do you think there's going to be a backlash against this? I mean, to the extent that people know about it, it seems to have caught a lot of people by surprise, and as you can expect, don't see it as a particularly good prospect going forward. Do you think the Tories will backtrack on this? Because it does seem, at least, that this was supposed to go out. This was a manifesto commitment back in 2017, supposed to be rolled out quite soon, but has not been heard much about it. I know they're busy with other things, shall we say, but nevertheless, do you think this will actually come to pass in the end?
Yeah, it looks like it. I think we're only a matter of weeks away, from what I understand. I didn't know actually was in the Tory manifesto 2017. I didn't spot that one at all. As for being a backlash, I saw a survey result the other day. Something like only about 20% of people are aware of it at all. It hasn't had much news coverage, and obviously, it's like you say, it's been drowned out by Brexit. And the other problem with having a backlash is that it's difficult to find people who are going to go on about this issue too much. Do you know what I mean? There are people who will say
raises suspicions, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. There are people who, like me, have libertarian principles, and we can kind of blend it into the rest of our our interests. But taking on this issue single-handedly, if you will, is people don't really want to identify themselves exclusively with the viewing of hardcore pornography online.
Do you fair enough. Do you think that this is really about, I mean, the government are claiming that this is about protecting children from what they see. Do you think it's really about that? I mean, or is it actually about them buying into the view that pornography is bad for society and bad for adults? Because that's my suspicion. It's certainly off the back of the policy I mentioned in 2014. Yeah. That would seem to be where it's coming from.
And it's quite mainstream, that view as well, because obviously you have the kind of more old-fashioned sort of Tory, ban this filth, should we say, kind of approach. But then you also have this kind of new, more feminist-ish kind of, concern about what that kind of exposure of porn to young people does to their view of women and the view of each other and all that kind of stuff.
Because it goes back to that sort of 60s movement to ban pornography, the kind of Andrew Dworkin kind of movement. And the problem with that is I just don't buy into it. The idea of media effects theory has been long debunked, and yet it keeps coming back as an article of faith. The list that I mentioned that the Tories came up with of the types of pornography they wanted to prohibit were all justified on the basis that they could influence people to cause violence. That was the idea, and I just don't buy into that. Well, we know that's not, the data's in on this.
Yeah.
It's not the case that when people consume this kind of material, they enact it. In fact, the opposite could be true, because it could be a kind of cathartic thing. It's a fantasy. It's about indulging in fantasy so that you don't endanger anyone in the real world. So, I mean, I don't know what you think about that, but it's just...
Well, I don't know. It's a good question, because I don't really know where this has come from. It doesn't seem to me like there's been much of a grassroots movement demanding a Porter's pass. I don't think any newspapers have been particularly campaigning for it. I could be wrong. I dare say there's been people here or there. I'm sure feminists in particular have been mentioning it from time to time. But this has come out the blue, as far as I and indeed most people are concerned. So I don't know. I'm not going to say that they're insincere when they say they're not worried about the children, but certainly with a lot of the nanny stuff I write about, the claim to be doing it for the kids is nearly always disingenuous.
Hi, I hope you're enjoying the show so far. So, as Spiked readers and listeners to this podcast will know, Spiked has no paywall and no subscriptions. It's contributions from our readers, from our listeners, that keep us going and growing. So to those who already give, thank you very much. And if you'd like to make a donation, or even better, set up a monthly donation, just go to spiked-online.com and hit the big red donate button in the top right of the homepage. Anything you can give really is greatly appreciated. Now, back to the show. Next up, let's talk about nanny state sock puppets. So if you're a regular listener to this podcast, a name you'll hear time and again is Public Health England, usually spat out from the side of Chris's mouth when he's talking about one policy or another that they're advocating. But what you might not know is that PHE was not only set up by and is funded by the government, but it also funds various other nanny state pressure groups. And this is part of a phenomenon that Chris has been writing about for a long time of state-funded activism, sock puppetry, whereby in effect you have the state funding people to kind of lobby the state again, in effect, to pass certain laws, introduce certain policies, and it's the subject of a new IEA paper that Chris has written. So, Chris, can you tell us a little bit more about how this works? Because I think it's fair to say it's an area of the whole kind of nanny state blob that people don't necessarily fully know about.
Yes, and not just the nanny state blob. I mean, various kind of fairly unpopular causes get a huge amount of state funding, both from local government, from central government, and at the EU level. In fact, the EU is the worst for it. I mean, they just fund thousands of so-called civil society groups, often up to 100% of their funding, but very frequently more than 80% of their funding comes from the EU. And these organisations, funnily enough, are quite pro-EU, and they're keen on further integration and European citizenship and all these kind of ideas. I'm interested in it, particularly for, as you say, for the nanny state aspect of it, because again, so-called public health legislation, taxes, they're not particularly popular with the public. There's never been much of a grassroots anti-smoking movement in this country. There hasn't been a grassroots temperance movement for over 100 years. And so the state steps in really and not necessarily creates these organisations, although it has been known to, but certainly funds them, and again up to 100% quite frequently. And then they go about lobbying the government. And if you look at any public consultation responses, which you probably don't because you're a normal person, normal people don't respond to these things, you'll find it just chock-a-block with publicly funded organisations, all with identikit responses, all saying exactly the same thing. The government needs to do more, government needs to do more, needs to clamp down, blah, blah, blah. So I wrote about this for the IA in 2012, and I just returned to it with this new report, which is called Still Hand in Glove, just to see how things have changed. And there are reasons to think things would have got better as far as the taxpayer is concerned, partly because the government introduced a clause into its contracts a few years ago saying this money cannot be used for lobbying, advocacy and campaigning. And also, of course, we've had austerity. We've had a lot of cuts in the public sector, and you would think the kind of low-hanging fruit for those cuts would be third sector lobbying organisations just go around making a nuisance of themselves. And cut a long story short, what I found is actually there has been an improvement in England in terms of what Westminster departments are funding. They've definitely closed it down. At the EU level, it's still as endemic as ever, on the other hand. And interestingly, local authorities, which have had more or less 50% cuts, I think, on average, local authorities have faced, they can still find organisations who they can fund to go protest the Coke lorry turning up in their town at Christmas time. And the Scottish and Welsh governments have been doing it more and more, actually, particularly in Scotland, where in the Scottish government, the SNP, they seem to want to really make a name for themselves for being nanny statist. They've obviously got minimum pricing. They want to try and outdo the government on the food stuff, which isn't easy because the government's gone completely ballistic on the food stuff. So they've formed and funded various sort of nanny state groups in that area, as well as in alcohol, where they're almost entirely state funded. So it's still a big problem, and still, generally speaking, when you see somebody pop up on the TV saying we want to clamp down on sugar or tobacco or alcohol, more often than not, they'll be government-funded sock puppets.
Andrew, what's your thoughts on this? Was this something you were aware of?
I wasn't aware of this at all. So people are being effectively the government is paying for lobbyists to lobby themselves.
Exactly.
Of the point that they already believe. I mean, that sounds incredibly corrupt to me, to be honest.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Scotland in particular is out. Did I read? Am I right about this? That Nicola Sturgeon wanted to ban 2-for-1 pizzas. Is that? I mean, this sort of it tends to target poorer people, doesn't it? I mean, isn't this really what they're effectively doing? And they're doing this in the guise of we're looking out for you, we're looking after you. I mean, I find that incredibly patronising, and I don't trust it at all.
I mean, like one of the examples that comes up in your report, Chris, is, as you were saying around the alcohol thing, the Scottish government being the primary, if not total, funder of these two alcohol groups, Alcohol Focus Scotland and Scottish Health Action on alcohol problems, both of which have just been lobbying for minimum pricing, which of course has been this big flagship issue, something that obviously hits the white cider drinkers more than anyone else, all this kind of stuff. I mean, how has this grown? How has this sort of developed, I guess? And also, could you say a little bit about how there is this, how it feels quite just corrupt, because you also have these various smaller groups which are set up who then people get jobs further up the food chain later on. There's one thing you touch on, like it really is a sort of bit of a racket, really, isn't it?
I think it's a complete racket, yeah. I think it's Banana Republic stuff, really. And if you look at what's happened in Scotland with minimum pricing, yes, you've got these two groups entirely funded by the government, effectively the SNP, if you like. The SNP have always wanted to do minimum pricing, largely because they want to be a world leader in something. This is the kind of thing these devolved governments always do. They haven't got many levers to pull, so they always want to pull them all, draw attention to themselves. So you've got these other groups going like, you must bring in minimum pricing immediately, and then Sturgeon goes, we're responding to public demand. There's a lot of people asking for this. And then they have a big conference in Edinburgh, and Nicola Sturgeon comes along and she's a guest of honour, and they give her an award and praise her for her bravery. It's. I
think this should be more exposed. I mean, it reminds me of when I was involved with academia, and you'd find a lot of people quoting each other to give this kind of illusion that there's only one way of thinking about it. And this strikes me as the same thing. It creates the illusion of consensus, doesn't it? Whereas they're not going to be funding a body to lobby them who opposes their point of view. So no. I don't even. It just strikes me as really just wrong, and it's good that that people are drawing attention to it.
And academics are a part of this as well, aren't they?
Yeah, academics are part of it. In fact, increasingly so. I mean, although I say that at the kind of English Westminster level, things are getting better, what's actually happening is that these campaigners are moving away from kind of the blatant sock puppet organisations into kind of activist academic organisations and into Public Health England. Public Health England is a critical factor here. So Public Health England's only been around since 2013, has a budget of 4.5 billion. And it also kind of has all these, I think there's about 59 directors of public health, so they're all working at the local council level. And what do you think these people are doing? They're mainly just going like, I think we should have a ban in the street on smoking. I think we need to, we're going to oppose the opening of this new pub. We've already got too many pubs around here, that kind of thing. So they're just making a nuisance of themselves. They're all paid about £150,000, and they're all part of this big network. But Public Health England now is such a massive organisation. And it is judge, jury, and executioner, effectively. It does the lobbying, essentially. You know, it will commission reports saying we need to have minimum pricing. It is reviewing minimum pricing in Scotland. What do you think Public Health England are going to say about minimum pricing in Scotland, other than it's been a tremendous success? The only problem with it is actually it needs to be 60 or 70p rather than 50p. It's obvious what they're going to say. Literally, their very first act when they were formed, in fact, a couple of days before they were even officially formed, was to come out in favour of minimum pricing.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to go to an academic zealot and ask their opinion on this, you know the answer you're going to get from the outset. Who was the guy that the government paid to, the academic who they paid to discuss the impact of the sugar tax? And he
Mike
claimed,
Rayner.
he claimed that God, he said God had told him that it was important that he supported the sugar levy.
Yeah.
Now, I suspect you know what he's going to say.
Right.
You know, like,
I mean, talk about a conflict of interest. I mean, he's a vicar who thinks that God has literally told him to bring about a sugar tax in England.
Yeah.
He then produces a research saying we think this is going to work, and then they commission him to review it to see if it's worked.
I love
he couldn't make it up, really, could he?
Is God in the footnotes of his study? Like, is that the source? Revelation chapter 12, whatever.
Before we get into the final section of the podcast, I just wanted to let you know about a great way that you can support the podcast, you can support the show, get our message out there to more and more people that will cost you nothing and take just 1 minute of your time. All you've got to do is give us a rating and a review with your chosen podcast provider. It really is that simple, and it will be a huge help. So thanks so much for your support, and back to the show. Finally, let's talk about Sadiq Khan's junk food ad ban. So in November last year, the Mayor of London announced that there would be this ban on junk food advertising on the Transport for London network. In March, it's kicked in, and there's already been some hilarious consequences, largely to do with around what actually constitutes junk food. So the big example was Farm Drop, which is a very worthy kind of organic food home delivery firm. And one of its very kind of wholesome ads, a very middle-class family gathered around the kitchen table, all sorts of foodstuffs laid out. They actually had that ad basically passed through the public health censor, and they made them take out pictures of, I think it was bacon, butter and jam, because it actually was against the standard that they'd set. And so whilst with junk food ads, when we're talking about junk food, it obviously brings out in kind of the sort of snobby public health types' minds, McDonald's, KFC, it seems that it's actually, this ban in particular is catching all sorts of things in its net. So Chris, could you tell us a little bit more about this junk food ad ban, and how it was that this particular company seemed to be caught up in it? Does this show that the term junk food just has so little meaning, I guess?
Yes, well, it doesn't have any meaning. And I've been saying this for a couple of years, trying to explain to people that although your Jamie Olivers are going out talking about we need to ban junk food advertising, we need to ban buy one, get one free deals on junk food, there is no legal definition of junk food. There is only HFSS, which is food high in fat, sugar, and salt. This is Mike Rayner again, funnily enough. Mike Rayner was involved in the definition of high in fat, sugar and salt. And surprise, surprise, it's quite a puritanical definition. The whole anti-obesity movement really is, in my view, a thinly veiled snobbish enterprise being run by the equivalent of the Victorian reformers, really. And the junk food aspect of it really crystallizes that. Okay, so people, you're right, people do think of KFC and Pizza Hut and McDonald's when you talk about junk food. And so if you say we're going to ban junk food advertising, people assume that A, it's only going to affect a fairly small number of companies, and B, it's not the kind of food that they think children should be eating anyway, so that's okay. But there is, bacon clearly is high in fat and salt. Jam is incredibly high in sugar. It has to have 50% sugar, otherwise it can't even legally be called jam, right? It shouldn't be any surprise at all that those two products are HFSS and therefore covered by the ban. But this farm drop episode, I mean, Andrew couldn't have written it better as satire. I mean, it was the perfect thing to happen because it was such a woke company. It was such a ethical, we pay our farmers what they deserve and it's delivered fresh to your door, still with soil on it kind of thing. You couldn't ask for a better company to get clobbered with this stupid law. And it's well worth checking out their blog post about it because they still, I think I compared them in an article to Soviet citizen being dragged off to the Gulag, still insisting, we must speak to Comrade Stalin. There's been a mistake because they were going like, we fully support Sadiq Khan's ban on junk food. We just feel that it's been badly executed. And yes, absolutely, we should be clamping down on junk food. Child obesity is a real problem. We just feel that there's been a mistake. Basically, you can't have meant to include organic bacon because organic bacon's nice and it's expensive, and we sell it.
Andrew, what did you make of all this particular story, but also the whole junk food ban in particular, which has been one of Khan's key crusades, it feels like?
It is, because I don't, like Chris says, I don't really understand what junk food means. Whenever I've had posh food in posh restaurants, it's really, really fatty and really, again, I think they just mean food that poor people tend to eat, don't they? The cheaper food, sort of burgers and chips and everything. And there's this nebulous definition of what junk food is, but also this idea that people don't know it's unhealthy. This very patronising idea that when you have a burger and fries, you think it's some sort of health food. No, people know. People already know, and they make their own choices, don't they? With the Sadiq Khan thing, I just think he seems to be obsessed with this idea that if there are adverts on the tube or whatever, that it's going to just automatically modify people's behaviour. I mean, of course, I'm not suggesting that advertising doesn't work, but people aren't robots. They still make their own choices, don't they? I mean, they can see a picture of a burger and choose not to eat it, choose to go for the salad, although the salad in McDonald's is gross. But you know what I mean? There's an option there for you if you want it. Again, I think it's about like putting the choices back into people's own hands, allowing people to and allowing advertisers to advertise what they want within reason, obviously.
The cultural snobbery part of it is so interesting. This farm drop story was great because it made it so clear. It was a bit like, funnily enough, going back to porn and obscenity and stuff. I forget the US Supreme Court judge it was. He said, talking about obscenity, I know it when I see it. Yeah. And there's a bit like that with the junk food thing.
That's literally what she said, actually, in this blog post. She said, look, we all know junk food. We all know what junk food means. No, we don't.
How do they define it then? Is that literally it?
They define it in a fairly fiddly way, but basically you get, each food gets given a score. Right. And there's a sort of tier of how much salt, how much fat, and how much sugar you're allowed in. And it can only score 4 points. If it scores 4 points or more out of, I think, 40, it becomes HFSS. You can subtract a few points for protein and fiber, but basically all cheese, for example, is HFSS. Any dessert, any biscuit, anything with any degree of sugar at all is going to be HFSS. They're currently actually making it even stricter, this system, so that fruit juice doesn't even pass, pure fruit juice.
Because it's all sugar.
Because there's too much sugar in it. And previously they looked at added sugar, now they're looking at intrinsic sugar, so fruit juice isn't going to get through. About a quarter of all the sandwiches sold fail the test. I mean, I went through it all. It's unbelievable how many hundreds of products fail the test. Essentially, the ban on so-called junk food is a ban on food with just exemptions. It is. There's just exemptions for kind of raw fruit and vegetables and meat. But as soon as you put it together with anything, as soon as you cook it or process it with things like salt and fat, which of course you need to do to get it to stick together and to taste nice, it becomes junk almost by definition.
There's a bit of an incoherence of this as well, because the other thing that Sadiq is obsessed with is the advertising of body shape and unrealistic.
Beach Body Ready, of course. Yeah, a few years ago.
The idea that unrealistic body images are damaging. At the same time, he's saying people shouldn't be too fat. Because he's worried about that thing. And I don't know, maybe I'm not onto something there, but I think there is a kind of incoherence in the logic here.
I think it's another example of a fairly minor politician being given a few levers to pull and think, I'm going to pull them all because I can't do that much else. So I think it's classic virtue signaling, isn't it? These people want to be seen to be leading the way. And we shouldn't forget that all this stuff that Sadiq Khan's done and all the stuff that Nicola Sturgeon is proposing in Scotland, including the ban on 2-for-1 pizzas, is all in the government's obesity strategy here. There is nothing different. Exactly what Sadiq Khan has done with the tube and bus ads will soon be applied to TV before 9 o'clock under the government's proposals. And the government is also proposing a ban on discounting of food that is HFSS. it's crazy. It's going to mean, it seems, that you won't even be able to be given free poppadoms and curry houses.
Really?
Yeah, poppadoms are HFSS.
Are they?
Lots
I thought they
of
made
salt and fat.
I thought it was just lentils.
No, it's all salt, man.
Oh. I don't want to know that. What about the chutney?
Well, curries in general are extremely high in calories. And that's the other thing. It's not just salt, fat, and sugar. It's also just calories. So if something's quite calorie dense, it also gets points for that too.
It's just joyless, all of this, isn't
it? Yeah, of course it is. Of course it is. But it's Mike Rayner, the Lord told Tom to do it.
But just finally, Chris, at what point does this grind to a halt just because it gets so ridiculous when you do have, plain packaging for orange juice or something? Given that the things that they've set out for themselves are already throwing up these ludicrous kind of farm drop style examples, is there going to be a point at which just on the level of policymakers think maybe we need to pull back from this stuff because we look ridiculous?
There's a lot of ruin in a nation, as Adam Smith said. I think you can, as long as you do it incrementally, you can chop away a hell of a lot of freedom before people really do much about it.
Are we going to get to the point where you get those, like on cigarette packets, you got the images of sort of blackened lungs? Are they going to start putting that on food?
That's been proposed. It's
really?
Been seriously proposed. Graphic warnings and plain packaging for HFSS food.
And what is that? Yeah. Is that just pictures of morbidly obese people? Because that would be
things like that.
Wouldn't it?
Yeah. Pictures of diseased livers, fat stomachs, varicose veins.
And that's actually been proposed?
Oh, yeah. That's been for a few years, yeah. Especially on fizzy drinks.
Wow.
So we've got all that to look forward to.
In Scotland, apparently you can get contraband iron brew.
Yes. There's an effective black market.
There's a black market on pre-sugar levy iron brew.
Goes at quite a premium as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I mean, a
good few quid a can, I think.
I was in a pub with a Scottish guy, and another guy came up to him and said, "Oh, look, I can get you this stuff if you want it." It was really kind of like...
Seriously?
I'm not joking. He said, "I heard you're into the heavy shit, and I can get you some of this if you want. I got a garage full of it, mate."
That's amazing.
You've been listening to Last Orders. If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Do take a moment to give us a rating and a review. And if you'd like to support Spiked directly, please do consider making a donation. Just go to spiked-online.com and hit the big red donate button. Thanks for listening and see you next time.